Okay, welcome everyone to our first Friday lecture series. Today we have John Shearer with us for Stories and Memories of Clifton Park's Past. If you're joining us from home, please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and I will relay those to John. This is going to be recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again later, you will have that opportunity through the library's YouTube channel. And now I will hand it over to John.
Well, good morning, everybody. Everybody here in person, everybody at home. It's nice to be here. It's actually nice to be speaking to a live audience. Good to see faces. Today I'm talking about a new book that came out last year in October. And if you're interested, I did bring some if you want to acquire them. They're $20. That includes a tax and everything. And if you don't want to buy one today, you can buy them at the town hall. So first of all, I want to say how appropriate it is to be giving this talk today on the history of Clifton Park, because today, April 1st, is the 194th anniversary of our town. We were part of the town of Half Moon until April 1st, 1828. So in 2028, we'll be celebrating our bicentennial. So what I'm going to do today is, I mentioned the book, and so I'm going to go through and pick out some of the more interesting things that I wrote about in the book. And it's organized by the chapters in the book. So I have one or two things I'll be talking about in each chapter, just to give you an idea. What's your appetite? And of course, if you want more information, you have to buy the book. My introductory slide here shows a few of the things I'll be talking about to figure out. So I've got two mics, one for the folks at home. That's this one. This is for you. That's why I'm so wired up. Okay, so let's see what happens here. It's not advancing. Try what? Okay, there you go. There's the book. Now you folks at home can see the cover. And I point out this building on the cover of the book, which of course you all know where this is, correct? You do. Okay. This is a general store in Clifton Park Village. It was taken in probably 1885 or 1890. It's a very early picture. It's wonderful. Look at the high-wheel bicycle here, and people lined up out in front of the store for this photograph. This building still survives. Who knows which building it is? Yes. No, it's not the general store in Vischer Ferry. This is in Clifton Park Village on the corner of Fire Road and Route 9. This is Clifton Park Pizza. Now, do you recognize it? Maybe not. Anyway, the building's still there. We'll be placing it on our town register of historic places in May, and we have a historic marker to put in front of it. So it's one of the few buildings left in that area of Clifton Park Village. Okay. So here's the introduction. This is our town seal, and we didn't have a town seal until 1981. And this was a project of our Bicentennial Commission. This is the bicentennial of the American Revolution, which ran from 1775 until 1975 and until 1983. And so we had a Bicentennial Commission here in town, and we had a lot of projects. And one of them was a contest to come up with a town seal for the town. And it's amazing that in a couple of years, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the bicentennial celebration, which will be the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. But a lot was done during the bicentennial celebrations. Towns were made bicentennial towns, and Clifton Park was a bicentennial town. This was one of our projects. So people can, we had over 50 entries. People came up with ideas, they drew them. We actually had the schools involved also. The kids had put some entries forward. And then we had them exhibited at Clifton Country Mall, now known as Clifton Park Center. And we had a popular vote, and we whittled it down to, I think, 10 entries. And then we had a panel of judges from the Bicentennial Commission, the Town's Commission, decide which of the entries would win the contest. And I happened to be one of those judges. And we selected this one. It was very professional looking. And just lost power. Oh, there we go. And it was done by Corey Kirchert of Calico County. And was selected from, as I say, we had 50 entries altogether, which we whittled down to 10. So does anybody know what this symbolizes? Well, let me tell you. So we have, oops, I hit the wrong button. There we go. Technology, man. Okay, so here we have the seal. And so we have the two flags. One is the Dutch flag, and the other is the British flag, because we were under two different countries. Of course, New York was settled by the Dutch. Our first settlers here in Clifton Park were Dutch settlers, the Van Vrankens, the Brocks, a lot of Dutch people coming over to settle along the river in the southern part of town. So that's why we have the Dutch flag, and then the English, of course, took over from the Dutch. So we were originally part of the town of Half Moon. This isn't really a half moon, it's a crescent moon, but that symbolizes the fact that we were originally part of the town of Half Moon. The 5 stars are the 5 main hamlets in the town of Clifton Park. So Bishop Ferry, Rexford, Jonesville, Groom's Corners, and Clifton Park Center. The date of our town's founding in the ribbon, 1828. The corn representing the Native American inhabitants who grew corn down on the flats along the river. And it was, they called the area Canastigione, which is an Iroquois term for corn flats. They would summer down along the river and raise corn. And because of the agricultural heritage of our town was primarily agricultural up until suburbia came in the 1960s. And so we have the sheaf of wheat here on this side. This represents the water, the Mohawk River, where the first settlements occurred. So, and then the ribbon with the date moving upwards towards the future. So that tells you what our seal represents. Okay, oh good, are you doing it or am I doing it? Oh, okay. Okay, so this is the next chapter, which is places. And one of the interesting stories here is about the Stony Creek Reservoir. If you don't know it, we have this body of water down near Vischer Ferry, which was created by the town of Colony, and it's actually owned by the town of Colony. So we actually have a piece of another town within our own town. There's over 1,000 acres that the town of Colony owns. And this was very controversial because town of Colony sort of came in. They needed a backup water supply for Colony. And in the late 1940s, they were looking in Clifton Park for this place for a reservoir, and the state actually approved it. So the people in Clifton Park were not happy about this. In fact, particularly the people around Fisher Ferry um, spearheaded a movement to try and stop the taking of the land for this reservoir, because that's what they did. They had to take private land. They reimbursed them, but a lot of people didn't think that they were getting enough for their land either. But they really didn't want the creation of this reservoir, especially the people in Fisher Ferry, because they would be below the dam. And if the dam ever failed, the village would be wiped out. So there's a lot of litigation, and part of the rally cry for not having the reservoir was this historic structure, which was called Visherdal. It was built by Francis Vischer in 1813. And Mr. and Mrs. Chester Hall had just finished restoring this house, this early house, and it was quite a show place. And it was right in the path of the reservoir. The reservoir would be over the top of the roof of this building. And so this was one of the rallying cries. They were trying to preserve this building, and the New York State Historical Association got involved. And but at any rate, since the state-backed colony, the reservoir came to be. And in 1953, as they dammed up the Stony Creek and the water began to rise, of course, they had to cut down all the trees first, but as the water began to rise around the foundations of this historic building, they held an auction. And they auctioned off pieces of the house individually, the mantles, the doors, and then they totaled that up, and then they auctioned the house as a whole. And auctioning it as a whole brought more money than the parts. So they sold the house to Mr. Goodwin, Dr. Goodwin, and it sold for $3,500. And the house was moved. The house was moved, and it now stands on Pheasant Lane in Menands, which is right near the Albany Rural Cemetery. And this is a photograph of it after it was moved. So what they did was they took out all of the doors, the stairway, the mantles, the woodwork. They built a frame, a wooden frame, and then they reinstalled all of the original woodwork, the mantles, the fireplace hearths, everything. And they put the house was originally solid brick. And so what they did was they just put a brick veneer on the outside rather than building it of solid brick. But all of the original woodwork and everything are in the house. And only a couple of years ago, it was featured as a Vanguard show house. And you could go through it. Maybe some of you toured the place. But at any rate, and then here, of course, is the construction of the dam across the Stony Creek to create the reservoir. And some of you may remember last year, the town of Colony wanted to sell the reservoir, and town of Clifton Park was interested in acquiring it until they took it off the market in August. And we don't know if it's going to be, up for sale again or not. A lot of people in Colony want to keep it as a backup supply, but here it is. We have a bit of Colony right here in Clifton Park. People. So this is a tombstone in the Omni Church Cemetery in Fisher Ferry, and it's for James Moncton. And you can see he died in 1905. He was murdered by his wife. So this happened during a thunderstorm. They lived on Englemore Road, and it's right near where Moe Road joins Englemore Road. There's a red house there now, but there's an old barn in the back. The original house is gone. A new house is built, but the barn is in the back. And so Mrs. Moncton, on a stormy afternoon, took the shotgun while her husband was sleeping and shot him right through the heart. And he thought that he'd been struck by lightning because of the thunderstorm. However, when the doctor arrived, they found the bullet hole. They took him to the hospital in Cohoes. This was Dr. Strang in Fisher Ferry who came up. And, the neighbors took care of the kid. their one son. And he later died at the Cohoes Hospital. And she was put on trial up in Ballston Spot. No, I think she went on trial in Cohoes, actually. And the papers are full of this trial. And the neighbors came to testify that, you know, he was a wife beater. She was an abused wife, and the son was abused also. And they talked about hearing these arguments and this yelling and screaming, and how sometimes he'd lock them up in the basement, stuff like that. So at any rate, she got acquitted of the murder and promptly moved out of the area. She moved to the Midwest. But good old James Moncton is here in the Omni Church Cemetery. When I do cemetery tours, I have an actor portray him. And the last actor I had really did a good job. So down in Fisher Ferry, we had a well-known illustrator who lived there, and his name was Russel Sambrook. He was a competitor of Norman Rockwell, and just as famous at the time. He did a lot of magazine covers and illustrations. And he and his wife, Beulah was her name, they bought a house in Fisher Ferry in 1892. It was to be a summer house. Some of you may know where this house is. It still stands. It's on the corner of Ferry Drive and Riverview Road. More recently, Bob and Laura Chodas lived there. It's a Greek Revival home right on the corner of Ferry Drive and Riverview Road. But at any rate, so this became their summer home until he died in 1956. And while he was there, he used a lot of local people as models for his work. So for example, in this particular illustration, this is Polly Bassler, who lived in Fisher Ferry. And this is Carolyn Keeler, who was a neighbor of Polly's. She lived in Fisher Ferry as well. And so he used these people as models for a number of his illustrations. As I say, he died in 1956, but the family held on to the land until 1961 when Beulah sold the place to, I can't remember their name, blank. But anyway, a family who purchased it, and the Reed family. And Jonathan Reed, the son, and his sister had horses there. And I talked to Jonathan back in the 1980s or 90s, and he was telling me about when they bought the house, that they found some drawings and things in the studio, his studio there in the house. Those have since been donated to the Town History Collection, which is housed here in the library downstairs. So we have a picture of the house that Russel Sambrook did, and a couple other drawings that he left behind in his studio. And then later on, she only sold the house and a couple acres, held on to some acreage, which was later acquired by a former town supervisor, Kevin Daly. And he had a subdivision built just west of Fisher Ferry on those lands called Sambrook Edge. So that's why it's called that. Pardon me?
Where was she from?
Where was Sambrook from? They had a place in New Jersey. I forgot where in New Jersey. And she was, and Watervliet also. I think she was from Watervliet. Yes, and that could be tied into the family. They have a connection. They have a connection with Watervliet, but at the time of his fame, he had a house in New Jersey, and this was their summer place. Okay, so this is a drawing done by a local artist, Sandra Bowden, who later became very famous for her paintings. A lot of her paintings are in churches around the world. But this is a drawing of Old Pete. Now, Old Pete was sort of like a hermit, and he came around. He was from Round Lake, but he came around Clifton Park in 1958 or 59. And he first stopped, well, one of the places he stopped at was the Gifford Farms. Anybody remember the Gifford Farm on Fisher Ferry Road? Yes, yeah. Yes, strawberries, beans. My son got his first job there picking strawberries. Yeah. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, it was on Fisher Ferry Road, right across the road from what's now known as Summerlin Estates. I think that's in fact, Summerlin Estates was part of the Gifford Farm. They owned property on both sides of the road. And so old Pete stopped there and they hired him to trim their hedges. And because he had no home, he was homeless, they sort of looked after him. And they had a chicken coop on their property across the road from their house. And they let him live in that chicken coop. And there was a spring nearby that he could use for water. And he would do odd jobs. He would cut wood for people and do things like that. And so people, I know Isabel Prescott remembers seeing him walk down Fisher Ferry Road towards Hatchie's or Rosen's. Anybody remember Rosen's? Well, we got one old timer here. It was on the corner of Grooms Road and Fisher Ferry Road where the Stewart's now is. That used to be a mom and pop store. Some people call it Hatchie's, some people call it Rosen's. And so he'd be seen walking down Fisher Ferry Road, to buy something at the store. And Isabel said, you didn't want to get too close to him because he sort of reeked. He had an odor about him. But the Gifford family would, on cold nights, they would let him come into the house. And on Christmas, they would have him for dinner. He and his dog, he always had a dog that would be with him. And in later life, the community church over on Mill Road would help take care of him and provide him with food and stuff. And once a week, the women of the church would bathe him. And he really enjoyed that. At any rate, he died, and Sandra Bowden was a member of the community church, and she lived on Grissom Drive and Crescent Estates, and they helped take care of him as well. And she did this drawing of him. And when she moved out of the area, she gave the sketch to her neighbor. Her neighbor then donated it to Captain. And somebody who bought it at Captain, I talked them into donating it. And if you want to see the original sketch, it hangs here in the library, just outside the history room downstairs. And he passed away in 1979. He finally went to the Saratoga County Infirmary where he passed away. But a lot of people remember him around Clifton Park. Another old timer was Harold and Helen Cattell. Anybody remember the Eggatorium on Fisher Ferry Road? I'm going to have to interview you. Okay, so do you know where the Oaks subdivision is? Okay, that's where Harold and Helen Cattell bought 120 acres of land in 1941. They were operating a chicken farm on Route 50. They had, I think, about 2,000 chickens. But when they moved onto their new farm in 1942 on Fisher Ferry Road, they eventually had 10,000 chickens. And it was a self-service. They would have the eggs out by the road, and you would stop and get your eggs and leave your money there in a bucket or something. And they did that until 1971. Finally, by 1971, they stopped doing that, and then they started a farm, and they would sell produce there at a stand or take it by truck to the market in Menands. And they would, sell corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and stuff like that. Then in the 1960s, around 1965, 66, thereabouts, because their son and daughter were interested in horses, they rented horses. They made trails along the farm so people could rent horses and ride along the trails. They did that until about 1967. They also sold Christmas trees. I remember we moved here in 71, and we bought our first Christmas tree there on their Christmas tree farm. Well, anyway, Harold was also very, instrumental in the Grange. The Grange was an important institution here in Clifton Park. The building still stands on Sugar Hill Road, right near the historic Groom's Tavern. And that was the place where all of the social events of the town were held. They had oyster suppers, they had dances, plays, all sorts of things happening at the Grange because we were basically an agricultural community. So this was very important. And Harold was the master of the Grange for a long time. So I interviewed Harold and Helen in 2002. In 2002, yes, I think it's 2002, in the fall, and they go to Florida. And then in the spring of 2003, we honored the Grange. There were only 15 members left of the Grange at that point, and they were all in their 80s and 90s. And we honored them because they had taken such good care of the Grange Hall. They kept it up. And so the Preservation Commission gave them a preservation award for doing that. Then the following year, they decided they were just too old to keep it up, and they donated the building to the town in 2004. But when we honored the Grange, it was sad because Harold had died in Florida over the winter, so he wasn't there for our town board meeting in 2003, and I was just grateful that I had the opportunity to interview him that fall before he left for Florida. So another farmer in the area was Walter Englemore. Now, you all know where Clifton Country Mall was built in 1975, right? Well, this was the Walter Englemore farm before the mall was built. And I was always annoyed when they renamed the mall Clifton Park Center, because we have a hamlet here in Clifton Park named Clifton Park Center. It's where the town hall is. That's Clifton Park Center. It's where the Clifton Park Center Baptist Church is. And so it didn't make sense to me to have another Clifton Park Center. But Clifton Park Center Road now connects the two Clifton Park Centers. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, this is Walter Englemore in his truck. He had a truck farm, and he took his produce to market in Menands or down to Albany or whatever. But I interviewed his daughter, Dorothy Englemore, who married one of the Peck boys. The Pecks were a big family here in Clifton Park, a number of them. And she married, I think she married Irving, who was, I think, the youngest. And she was in her 90s when I interviewed her. She still lived on a house on 146. But she was the daughter of Walter Englemore. And she said she remembers helping out on the farm when they got home from school. They went to the schoolhouse on the corner of Old 146 and Cemetery Road. The building was the town's first library. And that's where she had attended school. And so they walked there. And then when they walked home, they were expected to help with the farm chores. So they had to, polish tomatoes to make them look good. And she and her sister Gladys, who they called George, because they always wanted a son to help with the farm. So Gladys became George. And I guess, George would hold out the burlap bags, and Dorothy would fill it with like 100 ears of corn for sale. And they had some livestock also, and she talked about that. Families. Oh, this is sort of an interesting story. Okay, so there was back in 1997, there was a tag sale, a garage sale, just up the road from where I live. It was on Bishop Ferry Road, just north of the dump. I guess they call it a transfer station now. And it was on the west side of Bishop Ferry Road. The little house is still there. And so I stopped, and I found all of this family material. I couldn't believe it. Why wouldn't the family keep this stuff? There were family photographs going back to when photography began. There were tintypes, daguerreotypes, genealogical records, all this wonderful stuff, and family possessions, And I thought, what the heck? So, why are they selling this? Well, come to find out, well, I think his name was William Perkins, had died in a nursing home. And he was the last of the family. There were 3 sons, and I guess none of them ever married. And so this was it. So as town historian, I'm interested in this stuff. And I acquired a lot of stuff that dealt with the family history. And then I decided to explore who this stuff belonged to. And I found out that belonged to this, well, Mary Perkins was these people's mother, that she had these 3 sons. And Mary, this is Mary here in the 1920s, she was very active in the Grange. She worked with the young people at the Grange Hall, teaching them farm practices and things. And she married someone by the name of Winebender, who was from Groom's Corners, but her family was from down in Dutchess County. And her mother was Anna Roselle, who was sort of a woman's liver for her time. She climbed Pikes Peak and had her picture taken there at the top of Pikes Peak and stuff like that. Well, she was Anna Roselle's daughter. She married this, I think his name was Samuel Winebender of Groom's Corners. And so I connected all of this stuff. I had the picture of Anna Roselle on Pikes Peak, and I was interested, and I found out her parents, and I had daguerreotypes of her parents, and there's some genealogical stuff in there. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting stuff. Well, then in 2013, I got this email from Debbie Jones is her name. She lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And she's looking for information on the Winebender family. and she contacted me as town historian. And I said, well, you fit pay dirt here. Because what happened was, evidently, her mother, Marion was her name, she was adopted. And on her father's deathbed, her father told her that she was adopted. And so she was in her 60s at this time. And so she contacted an attorney who helped her find her mother, who happened to be Mary Perkins. And by this time, she had married Winebender. But Debbie's mother was born in 1919 out of wedlock and given up for adoption. And her mother had actually met Mary one time. But anyway, so Debbie was trying to find out more information about her biological family. And so there was a reason that I happened upon this collection and saved it. And she was so delighted, let me tell you. She struck a gold mine. And so I made copies of all of that stuff and sent it to her. So, there's so many things like this that happen in doing historical research and genealogy, and you just know that there's something else going on there. Okay. Houses and barns. So this is a great historic house. This is on Bruno Road. And it was going to be torn down for a subdivision. A developer had purchased this farm. Of course, it was a farm. And the house was to be torn down. So the Preservation Commission, in case you didn't know, we do have a historic preservation commission here in town. And we have a historic register program and an easement program for people who own historic houses. Well, at any rate, so before it was to be torn down, Preservation Commission is always given an opportunity to look at the building and at least document it before it's torn down. So we went to this building to check it out, and it was fantastic because not much had been done to it, hadn't been modernized. So all of the original features were still there in the house. And although the minister who was in charge of this, he was representing a lady in a nursing home. Of course, he was a little annoyed because we thought that this was a great house and shouldn't be taken down. And we were praising the fact that there was so much here. So we worked with the planning board, and they got the developer to subdivide this house in an acre of land off of the property and put it on the market. And the family bought it, just loved the historic house. and they've restored it. This is the way it looks today. It's been on several house tours. It was built in the 1830s by Platt Rogers, a man named from Platt Rogers, who settled here in Clifton Park from Dutchess County. A lot of the early settlers from Clifton Park came up from Dutchess County. They were usually younger sons who were looking for farmland because the oldest son got the parents' farm. So we were pleased about that, able to save this. Now here's one that we lost. Do any of you remember this barn? It used to stand on Grooms Road. It's somebody had brought it to my attention. I used to do a monthly article for the community news. And back in 1999 or 1999 or 2000, no, it was in 1999, someone wrote to me and said, you should do an article on that barn. It's going to be 100 years old in 2001. So I did an article on barns. Then this became the very controversial shortly after I wrote the article, because a developer purchased the land and he wanted to tear down this barn. The developer, by the way, was McCormick, the guy that owns the bank building, or Trustco Bank. And so it was before the planning board, and he was looking for a demolition permit. Well, when there's a subdivision, they sometimes have to do a seeker, some kind of there's a process involved. Well, he wanted this barn out of his way right away. And at the Preservation Commission was at the board meeting. We said, well, no, let's find out. Maybe that we can make some use of this barn. We should have a seeker done. More thought should be given to this. Well, come to find out, he then at the planning board meeting he said, well, I'll give somebody $10,000 if they want to move this barn to their property. Well, there was a person who owned property adjacent to where the barn was who said they would do that. They would move it to their property. Well, he heard that. And the next morning, very early in the morning, the wreckers were there taking down the barn. He didn't have a demolition permit. He was doing it illegally. And the people across the street videotaped the whole thing. And it was shown on all news channels. And it was very controversial, very controversial. And he threatened members of the Preservation Commission. There was litigation. He decided to sue the town. I had to give a deposition. He threatened me as town historian. And it was just harassment. After I gave the deposition, he dropped the suit. He knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. But it just goes to show you, people think they have all this power and they can do whatever they want. So, we have ways of getting even. I have friends, the Division of Historic Preservation, SHPO office, the State Historic Preservation Office, and I said, I think you should take a look at this piece of land. I think there was an Indian encampment there. And lo and behold, it was on a map at the State Museum indicating that there were probably Indian artifacts there. So they had to do a dig, and it held up the project for a couple of years. So much so that he got upset and sold the property to somebody else. This other person wanted to put in a subdivision that was like a bridal development where you cluster the houses and then you have all this land so that people, if they wanted to have horses, could have horses. It was designed for people who wanted to. And wouldn't that barn have been perfect for something like that? Well, that never came to fruition, but now I've talked to someone who actually lives in a house that's there, so somebody must have built homes there. Anyway, but that brought a lot of attention to historic preservation in the town. People saw all of this and they read in the papers about all this controversy. And people realized that, you have to be vigilant.
John, before you go forward, we had a question from somebody at home about the Platt Rogers house.
Okay.
They were asking about the quarter circle windows and whether that was a common feature at the time.
Okay, so this is a question from someone at home that was asking about, if I can go back. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Can you back up to the house? I think it's a previous slide. There we go. Okay, so they're asking about the quarter round windows up in the gable. And yes, that's usually a feature that indicates the federal style, which is usually early 19th century. That would probably have been 1830 is a little late, but you know, in the country styles hung on. So yes, those quarter round windows are not Greek revival; they're more federal, and federal architecture would be like the first quarter of the 19th century. Taverns. Oh, did we have a lot of taverns here in Clifton Park? And guess where the town board met? In taverns. Okay, in fact, that's where our town was formed in 1828, was at the Historic Rooms Tavern, which is now owned by the town. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with this landmark, the Clifton Park Hotel, which was actually, there were 3 buildings that were joined together to form this in the 1820s by Ephraim Stevens, was his name, and this area became known as Stevens's Corners. And sometimes the town board would meet at this tavern. Sometimes in other taverns, they spread it around, and they only met once a year at that time. So this is a picture of it about 1910, right here, and this is the owner sitting out in front, and then this is a picture of it in 1931. And you can see Route 9 going north. See, Route 9 didn't continue north until actually the 20th century. So what you would do, you would come up Route 9, which was the old Waterford Turnpike coming up from Waterford. You'd come over Guide Ward Road, which was part of the turnpike, then come north along what's now Route 9. And you'd come up to the Clifton Park Hotel. And you wouldn't go further north this way. You'd either go to the right to Mechanicville, or you'd go to the left and follow the Plank Road Turnpike up to Jonesville, and then Ballston Spa and Saratoga. Plank Road was a plank road. It was planked over, and you paid a toll to use it. And that's why we have a road in Clifton Park called Plank Road. It got separated by the Northway. But so anyway, and you might recognize this stone here. This was our World War I monument. It was dedicated in Memorial Day, I think 1919. And it was a nuisance to plow around because it was right in the middle of the street. And so it was moved to the Legion Hall on Grooms Road. That's where you'll find it today. So you can see this was a tourist home at the time. And I know there's going to be lots of questions. What's happening with the hotel? And I don't know. Linda Kukulski is the owner. Her family has owned this building since 1922. And she lives in Braintree, Massachusetts. She's an absentee landlord. And she owns about 15 acres along with the hotel. And she's trying to figure out what to do with this now. She claims she wants to restore it and do something with it, but she doesn't really have the capital or the know-how. She's a very difficult woman to deal with because she doesn't understand things. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to get her phone number because everybody that asks about the hotel, I want them to call her. Okay, public buildings. And we talked a little bit about this one. This was originally, it was built in 1842 as the Baptist Church. And then later it was used as School District 12. A lot of people still living my age remember going to this as school because the Shenandoah campus didn't open until 1953. And up until 1953, there was no high school in Clifton Park. If you wanted to go beyond the 8th grade, you had to go to Schenectady, Burnt Hills, Cohoes, Mechanicville, or Troy. And if you lived in Elnora or Jonesville, you could take the train to either Schenectady or to Mechanicville or Troy. So this was a big deal in '53 when the campus opened. And the last class to use this graduated from here in 1953 and then went to the high school. This was also the second home of the Clifton Park Library, then called the Shenandoah Free Library. For a year, they were in the Key Bank building, that brick building. You know where that is? It's a building right there on the corner of Route 146. They were on the second floor for a year, and then they moved into this building. And in fact, when we moved to Clifton Park, this was the library. It was quaint. I mean, wooden floors, it creaked, and you wondered if they could bear the weight of the books. But yeah, it was very folky. To 1981, it was the library. Then they moved over to, they were given property over on Clifton Country Road. So this is the class of 1954, the first class to graduate from the new campus. This was the 50th reunion. And so this was 50 years from 50. Thank you, 1904. 1904. And this was a very popular teacher, Mrs. Simmons. Everybody knew Mrs. Simmons. Yes, she was everybody's good friend and the most popular teacher. I did interview her. She was the first Black teacher at Shenandoah, and she told me about how difficult that was getting a job there. And we talked about her history. Her family has lived over in Rexford for a couple of generations, but it's very interesting because, you know, although she's considered Black, she's got more white ancestry than she does Black. And that's true with a lot of Black people. I think all four of her great-grandfathers were white. Yeah, Dave.
John, I assume she's passed away.
Yes, she has. Yes, yeah. And I did have the opportunity to interview her, and I have a lot of information on tape, which has been transferred digitally, thanks to Tanea. Okay, so this was kind of a great event. I was invited as town historian. The Half Moon town historian was there. We had a photographer there, and I collected all this information from their experiences at Shenandoah, the first class at Shenandoah. And they really got rolling on some of the antics that they did and some of the tricks they played on some of the teachers and things like that. It was a very fun evening. Churches. Okay, so this is the drawing is of the Omni Reformed Church, the first one that was built in 1802. Prior to that, as I say, the early settlers were Dutch, and they went to the Dutch Reformed Church over in Niskayuna, so they had to go across the river to attend services. By 1802, they had enough people living in the Bishop Ferry area to build their own church. It was built in 1802, and they decided to give the name of Omni to the community that was developing. And so they tried to rename Fisher Ferry Omni. It just didn't take because it was already being known as Fisher Ferry. And when the post office was established in 1833, it was Fisher's Ferry, '(S), Fisher's Ferry. And then in 1893, the post office dropped the '(S). It became Fisher Ferry. And by the 20th century, on maps of the 19th century, you'll see both. You'll see Omni or you'll see Fisher Ferry. By the 20th century, however, Omni sort of got dropped, Fisher Ferry, because the post office was Fisher Ferry, won out, but it's still the Omni Reformed Church. So that's sort of interesting. But what I wanted to point out here is finally in 1870, they had to build a new church. And that new church built in 1870, in 1886, had a fire during Christmas service. And they were able to save the pulpit and some things because the people were there. I guess the stove overheated, church caught fire, complete loss. And that's when the new church was built in 1886. And I think it opened in 1888, actually. But What's interesting is that we have this carriage shed, which is now gone, but this was on just down the road from the church. And I want you to notice, first of all, the weather vane on the original church, the fish weather vane, the fish weather vane here on the carriage house. Here it is on the new house that was built on this property. This is a ranch-style house, and they have this little cupola on the barn, and they must have taken it off of here and put it there. Well, the point is, this was the original weather vane for the Omni Reformed Church, and I tried to point that out to the congregation that they should have a copy made and offer it to this family and get this one back to preserve in the church. The carriage house is now gone. It was demolished when this new house was built. Anyway, I just thought that was sort of an interesting thing. Cemeteries. Okay. People are dying to get in this Jonesville Cemetery. It's just so beautiful. And this is part of the, you have graveyards. Churches have graveyards. But in the mid-19th century, well, in the early 19th century, they started this rural cemetery movement. It really began in Paris, France, right around 1800. But then it spread to the United States. And many rural cemeteries came into being around the time of the Civil War. Now, this was a philosophy where they thought that the cemetery should be not just for the dead, but for the living. People could go and stroll in the cemetery. And so they were landscaped. You had these hills and valleys, streams running through them. And then you had all these gorgeous statues and things like that that were made as monuments. It's also supposed to be educational. People could learn from studying the monuments and the tombstones and things. So this caught sway in America. And so we have places like the Albany Rural Cemetery, Oakwood over in Troy, and the Jonesville Cemetery here in Clifton Park. And it was laid out in 1864. You have to remember, the Civil War's going on. You have all of these bodies of Civil War soldiers being sent home. In fact, this is when embalming got its start. It was during the Civil War, so they could get the bodies home, preserved for funerals and burial. At any rate, this is from the original drawing for the layout of the Jonesville Cemetery. We have the original map, which hangs down in the history room here just below us, that was laid out. And it was done by Burton Arnold Thomas. He was from Sand Lake and West Sand Lake. He also laid out Vale Cemetery in Schenectady. And he also worked at the Albany Rural Cemetery. So our cemetery here in Clifton Park was laid out by a pretty important landscape architect. And it is a gorgeous place. And like most cemeteries, the hoi polloi are up on the higher ground, and then the peons are down below. So now there was already a cemetery in Jonesville. It was on Dyer Road or Dyer Street, whatever it's called. It was called Union Cemetery. And so when they opened this cemetery, what they did was they moved the graves from the other cemetery so it could be populated. So that's why you see earlier stones in the cemetery that are earlier than 1864. In fact, the founder of Jonesville, who died, I think, in 1850 something, his stone is there. He's buried there. But that's what they did. The Underground Railroad and Civil War, so we have ties to national history as well. Dave?
Quick question on that Jonesville Cemetery. They moved the monuments. How about the remains?
Dave wants to know, they moved the monuments. How about the remains? Yes, they moved the remains as well, as much as they could. Okay, so this house, some of you may remember it. It's in Rexford. It's near where Valhalla Country Club was located. It was torn down in 2006, but this was the home of the Knowlton family, and they had ties to the abolitionist movement. And I think they were part of the Underground Railroad here in Clifton Park. We have a number of connections with the Underground Railroad. In fact, the guy that operated the ferry down in Clifton Park, down in Fisher Ferry, in the 1850s was Samuel Cole. And he was a black man. And along Fisher Ferry Road, where the Oaks now is, was a free black family. And there was a free black family living on Ray Road. And I think they were all connected with I know they were connected with the abolitionist movement because they were granted land in the Adirondacks by Gerrit Smith. But anyway, so they were associated with the abolitionist movement, probably had something to do with the movement of slaves from the South to Canada. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Development. Okay. So we moved here in 1971, and it was, it was amazing because I think there was only one bank in town. So in order to get a mortgage, we had to go to Latham. To do any kind of shopping, you'd either go up to Saratoga, or you'd go to Latham. Latham, of course, was closer. Virtually, there was an early shopping center. This was the first shopping center right here, Clifton Plaza. And they recently had a remake of Clifton Plaza. They moved everything around. It's where the Price Chopper is. We used to call it the ghetto chopper. Anybody heard that expression? Yeah, the ghetto chopper. Okay, that's where. And that was here when we got here, and I think it opened in '68 with the Grand Union, which then later moved over across the road, and then moved someplace else. Well, and that became Starburst roller skating ring. And I remember taking my kids there to go roller skating. But anyway, so Park Pharmacy was there, and the barber shop. The barber shop has been there since 1968, and across the road there was a couple other stores. There was Barker's at one time, and that became Joy's. Yes. And now, what's theirs? What is it? Yes. Yeah. Ocean State Job Lots is there now. I know. They also had a movie theater there. Yeah, there's a movie theater there. You just take the kids there for movies, and they were cheap. They were like $1. I think, to go to the movies. We saw Star Wars there. But at any rate, that was it. And then in the early 70s, they were investigating. They wanted to build a shopping center, and they wanted to build it on the corner of Fisher Ferry Road and Route 146, Kitty Corner, from where the small plaza was, this Clifton Plaza. There was a gas station there. And they found out that there's too much remediation that would have to be done because of the gas station. So then they found this piece of land over by the Northway. So initially, the center of town was going to be right there where Clifton Plaza was. But they found this farm of Walter Englemore, and purchased that. And then in 1975, Clifton Country Mall opened. That was a big deal. And for now, people could actually do their shopping in town. And that was a big deal. And it was a big deal also because it was an indoor mall. You could go there in the winter. People could walk there in the winter, get some exercise. And then for some reason, they broke that up and made it an outdoor. I don't understand why they did that in the Northeast, but I guess people don't like to walk. They want to park right in front of the store they're going to. And so now it's not so much indoors. They have all these stores outside. But yeah, and I'm trying to think, I think the Carl Company was there, wasn't it? When it opened? Yeah, Carl Company from Schenectady. And there was a grocery store there too. I can't remember. I think it was the A&P. Yes, yeah. Yeah. So Okay, so talk a little bit about artifacts now, because we've been collecting quite a, okay. So artifacts also tell us a lot about how people lived here in Clifton Park in the past. This iron thing is a fire back, which would go in the back of a fireplace. The cast iron would heat up and it would throw the heat out into the room more. It would also protect the back of the fireplace. So a guy down in Fisher Ferry found this using a metal detector, and he's donated it to the town. It's now at the Historic Rooms Tavern, but you can see it says N period York, and there's an anchor and the date 1764. It's one of our earliest artifacts. And as I said, it was found in Fisher Ferry. Now, in 1764, there were only 2 houses in Fisher Ferry, so it had to have come from one of those 2 houses. And it was either the Christensen House or the Vischer House. And I did a little research on that. The whole thing appears in the book. But I also found out it came from the Sterling Iron Works, which was down in Orange County, New York. And they made anchors. That was their specialty, which explains why the anchor is in here. So it's sort of an interesting artifact. Here's a sampler. I go to antique shows. I like antique shows. And this one was up in Saratoga Springs. I saw the sampler. It says, America is my nation, Orange is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation, dated 1819. Well, the guy thought it was from like Orange, New Jersey or something. However, Half Moon, town of Half Moon, which was then incorporated Clifton Park, was known as the town of Orange for a short period of time. And it was between 1816 and 1820. So that's why this piqued my interest. So I went home, I did some research on Amanda Jones. I found out a lot about her. She was the niece of James Jones, who founded Jonesville, who established a tavern there in Jonesville. Her brother, Eldad Jones, was part of the Erie Canal Commission, and he's the one responsible for building the Rexford Aqueduct. So there are many, many ties. Her parents are buried in the Jones Cemetery, the family cemetery on Waite Road. We had just put up a historic marker there so people can find it. So I said, yes, this is great. And I forgot how much he wanted for it. I think he wanted maybe $350 for the sampler. So I talked to the town and they said, yeah, go ahead, buy it for the collection. So I called the dealer who lived in Burnt Hills, and I explained why I was interested in the sampler and that the town had agreed to buy it. He said, oh, I'll donate it. So he donated it. It's right downstairs in the history room now. Very, very interesting piece. We have a number of samplers done by schoolgirls here in town. This is Ruth Turner and her son. They're descendants of Nathan Garnsey. Nathan Garnsey came from Dutchess County in 1786, one of the early settlers of our town. And they built the Garnsey House in 1791, which is on Route 146. There's a historic marker in front of it. I knew about this portrait. I knew about it for years. When I saw it, or when I saw a picture of it, it had a rip. So Ruth had a conservator repair that rip. And as I say, I knew about it. I finally talked her into not donating it. She wouldn't donate it, but we did purchase it. And it hangs now near the supervisor's office in Town Hall. But this is a portrait of Nathan Garnsey Jr., the son of the first settler, who happened to be the second supervisor of our town. And it was done by a Schenectady artist, John Wilkie. And there's a number of other portraits of local people done by this John Wilkie. So I was very happy to acquire this, even though I got her down in price quite a bit, though. So anyway, we have that. Miscellaneous. Okay, this is Another interesting thing, so there was a house on Fisher Ferry Road. It was practically across the street from me, just up the road a bit. And it belonged to the last town historian, Howard Becker, who died in 1978. And he, well, he lived in this house, and it was purchased, was sold, not by him, but by a later owner of the house, to a developer for a 6-house subdivision called Pickett Lane. And we tried to save the house. Preservation Commission visited the house, and it had been remodeled quite a bit. So we decided not to fight that fight. And but before it came down, we were invited to take a look to see if there was anything that could be salvaged. So we looked at the house, and going around the outside, under all of this growth and under a big tree, we found what we thought was a tombstone. And it was in 2 separate pieces. I put it together for the photo. What it turns out to be is the dedication plaque for Lock 19 on the Erie Canal. And so this is what it says, Lock 19. It says, built by Haight, Blood, and Cady contractors, 1842, John McDonald, superintendent. And so this was an interesting thing. How did it get there? You know, he was a town historian. Maybe somebody thought that it should be protected, and they brought it up from the lock and left it on his property. I mean, if this had been plowed under, no one would have known about it. So we did salvage this. And these people most of these people were from Montgomery County. They worked on the canal, and they had trouble getting paid by the state. There's stuff in the records about them in 1846 complaining because they hadn't gotten paid for their contract work yet on the canal. Finally, in 1847, they got their money. Dr. McElroy, he was Clifton Park's country doctor from 1894 until his death in 1954. And we recently put a historic marker in front of his farmhouse on McElroy Road. As I say, a lot of older people were brought into this world by Dr. McElroy, those that live here in town. And recently we acquired the buggy that he used to make house calls. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we'll be exhibiting at the Groom's Tavern. But the more interesting thing that I tell about in this story is the story of this headless rooster. So the Quivy family, who lived near Burnt Hills on Good Street, they raised chickens, and they had this rooster. They called him Odell, was his name. And on November 26th of 1905, they were cutting off the chickens' heads to take them to market. Well, this one chicken, after its head was cut off, refused to die and kept living. And it lived for months without a head. And they would feed it through its esophagus. And so this became the talk of the town. And at the time, Dr. McElroy was this town supervisor. And he mentioned it to the town board, and they said, "Oh, you're the biggest liar ever," you know? And so the whole town board went to look at this headless rooster, Odell. And people from all around, you know, they would come on the train to Ballston Lake and then, you know, go up to this farm to see this. It was exhibited in Schenectady at the chicken show that winter. And it continued, and Dr. McElroy wrote a whole report on this headless rooster, and it continued to live until March of 1906 when it caught cold and died of pneumonia. So if you want to read more about this, it's in the book. So anyway, again, if you do want more information about some of these teasers I've been giving you, there are 2 books. The first one I did in 2003, Bits of Clifton Park History, and then the new one, More Bits of Clifton Park History. And so I thank you for your attention. You too at home, if you're still there. And again, lots of history to study, and happy birthday to Clifton Park.
If anyone at home has any questions, feel free to use the chat feature.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Yes. He still does. He's been interviewed by newspapers, and I know him, as a matter of fact. Yeah, usually. He has several bikes. He alternates. Yeah, and he's always riding around. He sometimes works down at the general store in Fisher Ferry. She has him park cars for events and things. Francis is his name. Yeah, she even had a T-shirt made with his face on it.
One of the graduating classes from the auto.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well,
He actually lives in Crescent. But yeah, he's always seen riding around on his bike.
Question from home.
Okay.
We have somebody from home wondering if the rooster ran around without his head.
Okay, the question at home is if the rooster ran around without its head. Yes, it did. Of course it did. Yes. And it would be with other chickens. But of course, it couldn't see where it was going because it had, so. Yes, back there.
I read the book,
Thank you.
I remember George Washington might have come from a well in Clifton Plaza.
Yes, yes. He crossed when he came to visit General Gordon up in Boston Spa. He crossed at Fort's Ferry at the river, and he was offered a glass of water from the well there as he reached the bank. And there's an eyewitness report of him crossing on the ferry. It's written up in Sylvester's History of Saratoga County in 1878 from the daughter of this woman who watched Washington arrive on the ferry and offered him this cup of water from the, yeah. We also have a connection to Chester A. Arthur, who taught school here in Clifton Park.
Another question is, what about
Okay, so the question is about the Ku Klux Klan, which, yes, was very active here in town around 1920. And there's a picture of the Klan parading in the 4th of July parade taking place in front of the Clifton Park Hotel. That seemed to have been the center of activity for parades and celebrations and things like that. And yes, it's very active in all in upstate New York at that time. It wasn't just Clifton Park. Dave.
John, you mentioned one or two homes that might have been way stations on the underground.
Yes.
Would the path from here have been up along the Champlain Canal, up through the Champlain Valley into Canada?
It could have been, the question is about the Underground Railroad and maybe the path being up along the Champlain Canal to Canada. It could well have been, in fact, Solomon Northrop was headed that way at one time, or he had a connection with the canal up in Whitehall. Yeah, so it could be. That seems logical. Other questions? Any questions from the? Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.